February in the morning. And today at the webinar, we are having with us one of the very experienced alumnus from the Young Reporters for the Environment program, Pedro Marcellino, and he's a former journalist and writer and film director with huge experience on writing a story and like practitioner on the field. So also you can ask different questions on the background of journalism and making stories. If you will have any questions during this presentation, please also write them on the chat. I will now stop sharing my screen and I will ask Pedro to introduce himself and start with his presentation. And thank you very much for now.
Hello, everybody. Hope everyone is doing all right. It's a little bit strange to be doing this and not really see anyone's face, but hopefully you can see me. Oh, I see Audrey is here and Christina. Hello, Audrey and Christina. Hello, everybody else. I'm going to start by getting you engaged. I'll be typing a little link on the chat box here, and I hope that you can, let's see. So I think this is where everybody sees it. I would like you to go on your phones. So don't do it on your computer so that you don't interfere with your Zoom window. But if you would go on your phones and type the following. There you go. pollev.com, P.J. Marcellino 874. If you go there right now, I'm going to activate a survey, and when you join,
Pedro, you send this message only to me privately. So yeah, I will just copy this to everybody once again.
Thank you.
To make it visible to everyone.
All right.
So sorry for interruption.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
it goes. Yes.
All right. So if you go to that link now and click on the response, I'll be able to see it on this side. I'm going to be sharing my screen now, Gosha. Right. So I wonder, oh, there we go. Well, it seems like most people are doing really well. It's very early for me, and I actually got up quite early, but I'm glad to see that no one is feeling really on the downside. There we go. I'm gonna share this with you guys. Gosha, can you see this result?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for testing. All right, well, thank you for letting me know how you're doing. I'm doing very well as well. Thanks for asking. And I'm going to move this right to the next slide. Before we go on, can you please tell me, and on the same poll, you'll see another question. Can you please tell me where you're connecting from? Just click on the map. Oh, everyone is getting quicker, so we're waking up. We have someone in Bermuda. Hello. Or the Bahamas, actually. The Bahamas, I think. Well, hello, Europe. So, hi, everyone. I am very happy that you guys are with me today. I'm now going to just unshare the survey and go to the next stage. So sharing my presentation here. Bear with me for a second. Gosha, can you please confirm that you can see my window?
At the moment, it's a black screen.
And now?
Yes, now I can see it. Yes.
All right.
It goes.
So let's get this train moving. So the first thing that I wanted to tell you is that I made a little change to the title of this webinar from what you might have been advised by Gosha. I called it The Art and Craft of Storytelling. And I called it that because storytelling is really at the center of what we're going to be talking about. Of course, we are reporting, we are writing news, we're writing stories. But therein lies the crucial word, stories. I would like to start with the very basic concept that we are all narrative beings. We connect and communicate through storytelling. That is the truth about every human being from the beginning of language. And so storytelling comes in many ways, shapes, and forms. And if we move to the next slide here.
If you can also speak a bit louder, that will be great.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, for those of you who don't know me, I am, oops, there we go. I am a former Young Reporter myself. I was a member of the Young Reporters in 94, 95, participated in my first mission in 95 in the Arctic. And I usually like to tell the story that I'm probably the oldest Young Reporter alive that we know of. It's probably not true, but I like to go with that story. So that's the power of storytelling. If you tell it, it's a story. I went on to become a journalist for a few years and a social researcher. Then I worked in political analysis, and for the last 7 years or so, I've been a filmmaker, which, as you probably know, is another way of storytelling. It's just another technique or another tool to convey stories that are important somehow. And for me, perhaps that's the connection with YRE. For me, that storytelling element and the responsibility that comes with it is connected to my time with Young Reporters. So I work on social and political impact stories up to this day. Now, let's get right into this. What is storytelling? And before I tell you what storytelling is, I am going to get you guys clicking again. I hope you still have your surveys open. I'm going to move this on to the next slide and stop sharing this one and share this screen right there. All right. Can you please go to your survey and tell me the 1 or 2 words, type the 1 or 2 words that you would use to describe storytelling off the bat. We're going to try to get a nice little thought cloud. Just whatever comes to your mind. Oh, creativity, that's the first one. Emotion, okay, I'm liking where this is going. Give me a few more. There's no wrong answers here. This is not a test. But the more words you give me, the more beautiful our cloud will get here. Connection. And personal, all right. This is looking good. I'm going to share it with you guys now. Oh, look at that. Very nice. Okay, well, so it seems like we're already kind of on the same page. I'm even going to do a little print screen here. As I said, some of it are always you can expand it a little bit more for our context in terms of news. You could go to the nation, especially about recent events. And if you want to be more precise and go into the definition of journalism, then it is the activity or profession of storytelling, of writing for newspapers, magazines, etc. Now, the words you mentioned are perhaps more in line with this part of it. So storytelling in the context of YRE. Storytelling is about creativity, it's about content, it's about history, and here I would maybe say history slash story, because you don't always have to use history with a capital H. Experience, so you are perhaps speaking from your own experience, but you're also perhaps using experience that others have conveyed to you to convey a story to someone else. The idea of marketing here is not always relevant in journalism, but in this case, we are talking about social engagement experiences. So you are indeed using a few marketing skills, particularly if you are working, for instance, in campaigns, which is not really the focus of what I'm doing here. But if you are submitting something to YRE that is on the subject of a campaign, you are definitely using marketing tools. It's obviously about communication. It's always about sharing with others what you are communicating, but certainly at the center of it is emotion. So storytelling is a process of engagement. And in order to engage, you use that marketing element and you use emotion as a tool. You use emotion as a tool to connect the person on the other side with the story you're telling for a specific result. So if I move one more slide down, why do we tell stories? Well, we tell stories because we need to. I had an anthropology teacher many years ago, probably 2 decades ago, that described a few things that human beings have been doing for the last few centuries, thousands of years really, that we don't realize we do. He described the parts of our brain that have been wired from the beginning of times, and that includes some of our fears, but it includes also the ability to communicate through storytelling. So how does this work? We rely on stories and we rely on communication with our fellow human beings because our brain is wired as such, because at some point in evolution, it became essential for survival to tell a story of where the good hunting grounds were, where the good places to stay overnight were. And so you get to the point where the story now activates parts of the brain that allow us to turn the story into our own experience and to create relevance to our own life. So this is called mirroring. So you will not only experience a similar brain activity to what the storyteller is telling. So theoretically, you guys would have a similar brain activity reading as I am having right now as I tell you a story. But also, when you experience a story that engages with you emotionally, your brain reacts very much like it reacts when you have any other emotional attachment happening. And so that's with the release of dopamine, which creates a sensation of pleasure in the brain, which basically makes the act of receiving a story something that is important for the body. So you are biologically conditioned to enjoy the act of being told a story. And when processing the facts, you are using a couple of parts of the brain in which the whole of your intellect will be engaged. That includes your motor cortex, your sensory cortex, your frontal cortex. So whenever a story is being told and you are being engaged in it emotionally, you are actually conditioned to enjoy and process that information and make it relevant to you. That is basically the way we process stories. And this is why stories are important to us, because they are automatically absorbed by your brain. Now, is journalism storytelling? Let's take a little stop here and look at what this website journalism.co.uk referred to a few years ago, in 2016, I believe. This guy says, if you're a journalist, show me a damn story, said multi-award winning journalist and producer Scott Brinsberger to delegates of MotoCon, the Mobile Journalism Conference organized by RTE, speaking in a workshop on April 30th, 2016. He highlighted that regardless of the new technologies or new forms of production available to reporters nowadays, and this is very relevant to us, journalists must remember that the story is still everything. Storytelling is the most powerful thing in the world. It connects the dots of our communities. So this kind of goes back to this biological definition of storytelling that I gave you just a few seconds ago. Storytelling is also a way of connecting communities. But we go further. We go to narrative journalism. So narrative journalism is an immersive style of storytelling used to captivate readers by drawing them into the story with greater detail than found in traditional news stories. It is a popular format for magazines such as The New Yorker and can be difficult to define and write. And that is not untrue. It can be difficult to define and write, but it is perhaps, I would argue, the most engaging kind of journalism in the sense that it is the kind of journalism that tells a story that is perhaps most emotional. I wanted to give you an example of what I'm talking about. And so I decided to actually bring you a story of my own. So just over a week ago, I was in Iowa covering the Iowa caucus. Let me take a little break here. I'm gonna take stock of the room and figure out if folks know where Iowa is. So give me a second. All right. So go back to your polls and click on that map as soon as you see it, and go. Oh, nice. All right, well, 2 misses. Well, I was already there. So as you can see, it wasn't important. You're not getting any points for this. Not a lot of people know where it is. And that is because I was in the middle of America. It's a state like so many other states in that part of the country. I'm going to reshare my story here. And what makes it important is that once every 4 years, the primary elections of both the Democratic and the Republican parties are held in Iowa. And it's the first primaries in the path to the presidential elections in the US. So I was there reporting what was on the ground. And rather than reporting the news, I was doing a narrative story. So you can see here an example, a little excerpt of the story that I was writing. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, perhaps, to see if I can read the whole thing. Okay. And this is what I mean by narrative story. So at an Elizabeth Warren rally in Iowa City on Saturday, the senator arrives late from her previous event in nearby Cedar Rapids. You see the areas in black are the areas in which I strike a chord with people's experiences there. I go on to describe the patient line of voters waiting to see her. Then if you look around here, 20-something Ernest Kuchik is in high spirits and he's running down the line. I'm sure Gosha will be sharing this with you, so you'll have an opportunity to also read the whole thing. By inserting personal experiences, in this case, I write 20-something Mirnas Kukic is in high spirits. Sorry, no outside signs are allowed today, he tells one person. Betsy, another young volunteer, asks people if they confirm their presence by text message. You should have a picture of a dog. Warren's RSVP confirmations is a picture of her popular dog, Bailey. Including personal statements, including personal elements of a story, makes us connect more efficiently with that story. It makes us connect with the experience of the people that we are coding. So something that I do in my own journalism is using a lot of direct speech, a lot of quotes from people that are on the ground. So rather than saying what I am perhaps thinking, of course I am writing the story, I have the power to write it in whatever way I want within the ethics of journalism. But even when you are moving the story in a certain direction, you don't have to be the one saying it. You can simply find people on the ground that are informing the story, and you can let their words say it instead, creating perhaps more relevance and a more unbiased coverage of what you are writing. So I will let you guys look at this a little bit later. Okay. It's a good example of what I think you can look at in terms of narrative journalism. I would also give you some names of media that I would recommend. The New Yorker is certainly one of them. If you look at the long reads on both The Guardian and the New York Times, those would be another two media that are supremely efficient with narrative storytelling or narrative journalism. You probably would be looking at the articles that come out in the weekend editions. And certainly if you are so inclined, check out The Atlantic, check out The Walrus, and for shorter form journalism, The Economist is perhaps the most pragmatic newspaper in meeting the threshold between newsmaking and storytelling. It's usually short news pieces within a page, less than a page sometimes, up to 3 pages or 4 maximum. But the methodology that The Economist uses is very much one of narrative storytelling, regardless of the size of the piece. So I definitely recommend, if you want good references of journalism, these are the ones that I would recommend in English. I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Now, how to craft and draft a good story. If you are in YRE, I am certain that by now you've had a chance to look at the YRE tutorials that are online on the website, including the Writing 101. Full disclosure, Writing 101 is a video that I was commissioned by YRE to do a few years ago, and which I did with another 2 alumni of the network. And on that video, which I'm showing you the link here, but you can find it on the YRE page. I'm not going to show you now. On this video, you will find the basics of what elements are necessary for your story. And I'll go through them really, really quick so as not to repeat them. And I'll focus on a couple of them perhaps a little bit more heavily. So first of all, choosing your topic. Choosing your topic is essential because you want to make sure that whatever angle you use is an angle that is attractive to people. There's 100 different ways to go at a story. You need to pick the one that you think is going to be the most unique. You need to pick the one that you think is going to appeal to people the most. Is that perhaps going through the angle of a specific person, telling the story through the angle of one person? Or is it an overall event? So in Iowa, to give the example of what I was doing there, I could have been one of thousands of people reporting the general vibe of what was going on, what the election was, what the results were, but that was not what I was interested in. Instead of that, I attended the rallies with all the candidates and talked to people and listened to what the mood in the room was and quoted people in each of them to try to understand what the general feeling was and what the different currents in that election was. So, or were. For me, the story in Iowa was the story of how people are interacting, what's happening on the ground, what are the little things, why are people there, why do they care? Why are they spending 5 hours of their night engaging in voting and listening to candidates? That was what I was focused on. So choose your topic. Find a topic that is perhaps something that everyone is talking about, say climate change or microplastics. Whatever story you find an angle that is something that we haven't heard before and try to tell a story around that. Find an emotional entry point. You know, if you are going to tell the story of the little turtle that got caught in a piece of plastic and died, maybe tell the story of how you came to know about that. There is a very recent photo of a turtle who passed away, in which the story that I saw was about the journalist that took that picture, the photo reporter that took that picture. So that is a very nice way to tell you about what plastic is doing in the oceans. You see this shocking picture of a dead turtle, and you're hearing about all the ways in which this happens, but you're listening to that through the angle of a story, and that is the story of someone who actually snapped that picture and who was moved to make it into something bigger. So that comes to make it global. Create an angle that is relevant to people all over, depending on what your audience is. Could be make it national, make it international, make it global. In our case, we are writing for a global audience. So you need to think, how is your story interesting to people on the other side of the planet? And in our case, I would say that the easiest way to do this is to report about the simplest human experiences. Whatever you experience in Slovenia, in Bermuda, in Brazil, in China, whatever you experience on your turf is something that people have in common in other places. So the more high concept you go, the less connectivity you will have. The closer to the human level you stay, the closer to the human level stories you stay, the more relatable your story will be, because odds are people on the other side of the planet will have very similar experiences. And as we saw when we were looking at the biological understanding of storytelling, you are encoded to understand the story based on your own reality. So you might be telling a story in Slovenia, but someone in Brazil is listening to that story and adapting it automatically to their own context. So focus on the human level of the story. What is happening on the ground? The higher concept you go, the more detail is lost. In order to tell a story like that, you need to do your research. So research, 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 never enough. Investigate, talk to people, talk to experts, listen to their opinions. Write for the 21st century, that is something that I think is really enhanced in the Writing 101. Understand that media has changed, that we are obviously using different tools, digital tools, electronic tools, and that the attention span has changed a lot. So you cannot possibly be writing stories that are 4 pages long on web media, which is what we mostly use in YRE. So be aware of that. Be aware of the fact that most people spend about 3 to 7 minutes online. And so make sure that you have a story broken down in pieces that are easily digestible, that your titles are snappy, that they will lead people to want to read what comes after that. Know your basics, of course, and that is who, what, where, when, how, why. Those are the basics of journalism. They've been the basics of journalism for a very long time. They will continue to be the basics of journalism for a very long time. So make sure that you address those things, typically between your title, your lead, which should be really heavy on those elements, at least the who, what, where, when. Ideally, try to throw the how into there if it's a short how. If not, go with that in the first or second paragraph of your story. By the time you get to the second paragraph, you should have the gist of what you're writing about in a way that is your thesis statement. So you're really going about telling your story from the get-go, and then you can go into detail. Add photos, add captions, particularly in YRE. And if we are speaking specifically of YRE, it is important to add imagery. If you mention a technician, an engineer, an environmentalist, have a picture of this person in their natural habitat, in their place of work, and add a caption. And when you add that caption, make sure it's a short caption, no more than a line or two, depending on how extensive your article is. If it's a long article, maybe you can do a couple of lines, 1 sentence. If it's a shorter article, probably just a very short sentence is enough. And rather than repeat what we see in the picture or repeat what's in the text, related to the text. If in the text you mention a quote by this person, then you might want to say, engineer so-and-so standing in his lab at this place. That is a perfect caption. It tells you who that person is, and you relate it to the person telling the story in the article. It tells you where the person is, but it doesn't necessarily describe what's in the picture, because at the end of the day, you do not want to describe the picture. You want to add to what the picture is already showing. Make sure you do your interviews, and that doesn't mean include a full paragraph of text. It actually means It means simply that you, I'm sorry, I have interference here. It actually just means that you take those interviews and you take a sentence or two or a word or two and you weave that into your own writing so that it tells the story that you want to tell. So you do not need to include a number of lines of interviews because that's actually what interviews are for, not what an article is for. In the article, you're using those interviews to inform what you are writing, not what an interviewee has said. And then the most important thing, edit, edit, edit. Whenever you think you're done, that's still a draft. Edit and edit again and edit again and edit again. Keep editing. I still look at texts that I wrote 10 years ago, and every time I look at them, there's a change that I will make. So a story is never done. We keep changing, and as long as we keep changing, our relation to a story on paper will keep changing as well. There's two technical elements that I put as on the right side here, your headline and your lead. Obviously, those are technical elements that are crucial to your story. You want to make sure that your headline is snappy, that it's not heavy, that it's not overly lengthy. And in your lead, as I mentioned in the basics, you want to make sure that all the key information is in there. Who is doing what, where, and when. You don't always have to include those three. It's usually advisable to try to. But if you're finding that it's getting too clunky, that it's just too much information to include on your lead, you can drop one of them. But you still have to have a lead that tells you the basics of what that story is going to be. And that is even the case if your story is human-centered. So if you are using a character to lead you through the story, you still want to have that be the main focus. Right, so to relate this back to that story of Iowa that I told you, this is basically an example of what I was just mentioning. So I interviewed people, regular people on the ground. I took generally 5-minute interviews with them, so that's a lot of text. I almost used nothing of it. What I used was the one thing or the two things that struck me the most about a specific conversation. And I included that as part of my story. And this, what you see on screen, is part of the social media coverage that I was doing in parallel to the text story. So in here, I basically use folks that I met to color the experience on the ground. I'm not trying to portray my experience. Of course, I am telling the reader, this is what I saw, but really it's through the words of the people that I saw on the ground and that I interviewed on the ground that I'm conveying that experience. So it's not my experience per se, it's whom I met and what their experience is. And I think I'm about to wrap up here because the time is running out, and I will just finish with this. As some of you might know, that I'm a member of the jury for the International YRE competition. This was my favorite photo and my favorite story of last year's competition. And what I like about this story in particular, and you might see that in my Meet the Jury video as well, what I like about the story is the fact that it's very efficient in telling the technical side of what is expected in a YRE story, but also engaging the reader through a human angle, in this case, by telling the story of her grandmother and how she understands her contribution to the environment. You see the story from Singapore is a story like so many others, but the fact that you give me a clear character and what she does and then relate that to the global experience made it so much more relatable to me. And this is why I really enjoyed the story. I really enjoyed the way it was told. I think I'm going to wrap it there. There's a couple of things that we could have done to improve that story. If we have time in the Q&A, I'll go back to that. I'll leave you with this. A good story, and these are definitions from one of the pivotal institutions working on storytelling and journalism. the American Press Institute. A good story is about something the audience decides is interesting or important. A great story often does both of those things by using storytelling to make important news interesting. We are overburdened with information, and so making things interesting for people is essential. Find the angle that you haven't seen before. Find the thing that made you curious when you were listening to some story or researching your own story. Focus on that. Don't try to cover everything. Try to cover one thing that drew your attention, and explore that, dissect that, because when you do it, that's when you find the really interesting details, the really minute details of what storytelling should be. Gosha, I am going to leave it at that. I want to give it some time for questions and answers. I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yes, please. If you maybe will stop sharing the screen, I will.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, I'll share one more thing. Yes. Right here, because it's the you will be sharing this document. So for all of you watching, there's this.
Yes, there is an opportunity to share it with participants. We can mail it to everybody, and yeah.
So you have this beautiful graph here, which should tell you what the emotional level of storytelling should be. You can explore this. It's quite complex, but spend some time with it, and I'm sure you will have some great ideas. So what's your story? I'll leave it at that, and we'll share right now.
Thank you very much for this. It was marvelous to see how we can actually craft the story and make it interesting. And it's so important from a different points of view, not only for YRE people and the students that are participating in the program, but we are here also from eco schools and from other, and everywhere we need a story. We need a story that will keep our interest and will get work on our emotions. And that is something that people want to share and want to read about it. So, and also from all our programs, the experience that is coming, we are looking also for something that will boost the attractiveness of those activities. And it will be not only like report on the days on this, we went somewhere and we planted trees and we did something in the garden. We want the story that will keep our attention and that we can be proud of and share it globally. So that was so important from our perspective. And I would like to open floor now for some questions from participants. So please, you are free to ask Pedro until he's with us. And you can unmute yourself and go with some questions. Is anybody on that interested in some? Asking Pedro something more? I can maybe ask with the first question that I have, how to actually include our personal experience in the story without being too personal?
Well, you are including your personal experience in a story by the mere fact that you are writing the story. Yeah. There's, of course, in journalism, there's something that we call ethics, and you're supposed to be unbiased. But I think over the years, we've been concluding that there is no such thing as an unbiased cover. What there is craft. As a journalist, you are aware of the fact that you are biased. As a documentarian, I'm aware of the fact that I am biased, that I have a perspective. So for instance, I'll give you this example. I am certainly leaning Democrat, not Republican, if I were to vote in the US. But that's not my role. Right? Despite the fact that I am leaning that way, when I go and cover that election, I'm not going to necessarily make that the center of the story. The story that I'm telling is not my own, it's someone else's. So that's where the craft comes in, and that's knowing what the rules of ethics in journalism are. And so that's something that I think I recommended before that people should make themselves acquainted with. Thomson Reuters is a good source of information for those rules. Make sure that you know what those rules are. What is it that you're supposed to do in journalism? Or what is it that you're not supposed to do? It's not just about your own involvement. It's also about things like what can you include that people tell you. If someone tells you something is off the record, for instance, you need to know what to do with that information, because there are specific rules about how to navigate that. If someone tells you off the record after you interview them, that's not off the record. You actually don't owe them not including that. You have to call off the record before. So all of these things are things that young journalists, young reporters should be aware of. And I think the American Press Institute is a really good source. Thomson Reuters is another really good source. The Guardian is a style guide, which I think also provides some information on ethics and what to include in a story, how to include statements, etc., etc. Now, there's a different kind of story, of course, and that's the story in which you are doing a chronicle, a personal chronicle. But you, off the bat, you usually will have at the beginning, it will say, this is who I am, this is my context, what I do, and this is why I'm telling you this story. So those stories will often use the words I, me, this is my experience. So you are making the reader aware immediately that you are part of that story, that you're not asking them to believe that you are completely unbiased. You are asking them to listen to your story from your perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And that is very different from you writing a story that is supposed to be a news piece.
And we have another questions on the chat, and one of them that it pop-ups here. How do you choose a good story? Which are your criteria?
Well, I think I mentioned you look at a situation. I'll use the example you just gave, going out and tree planting, right? So if I just say, hey, here's a story about tree planting, not very interesting. There's really nothing that...
May I interrupt yet? Because maybe it's connected, because the other question there is from someone, how do you identify the target audience?
Perhaps it's connected, perhaps it's not. So I'll say something about the story first. You mentioned tree planting. Well, I remember reading a very fascinating story about tree planting. So I live in Canada. And as you know, Canada is one of the largest countries in the world, and it has one of the largest masses of forests in the world. It also has a lot of fires, and it also has a lot of areas up north that are kind of deserted. And so one of the things that happens here in Canada is that every summer people are hired in southern Canada, so close to the US border, and go and work as tree planters in the north as part of the reforestation efforts of the government. This is completely isolated. You're talking about places where people are in the middle of nowhere and they are camping. There's 200 of them living together in camps in the middle of the woods, and it's rough work. It's work in which you are surrounded by bugs, and the temperatures are very hot in the summer. There's so many bugs that people have to use head nets. So when I read that story, all of a sudden what I thought was, how interesting. I never knew anything about tree planting. I mean, of course, I know theoretically what planting a tree is, but do we know the logistics, the ins and outs of tree planting? We don't. And so by interviewing 10 people and telling me their story of how they got there and what their experience on a day-to-day basis is, all of a sudden, I will remember what tree planting is about because it was conveyed to me through a personal narrative. So I would always say that when you're picking your narrative, pick an angle that involves a person. We connect much easier with people than we connect with facts and figures. The part about identifying your target audience is a little bit trickier, but you should know in your own environment, right? If you are speaking about the YRE network, you should know if you're speaking to your school or if you're speaking to your local community. And if you are speaking to your local community, you will know that target audience way better than I know or Gosha knows. If you are speaking to the YRE network, then you know more or less that we are kind of like you. And so we will be interested by the same things that you are interested in. So if you try to convey that thing that interested you with the curiosity that brought you to the story, you probably know that you're targeting the right audience.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. You touched a few important things. First is like that we like stories about people and other people and listen about that, and that's rise emotions. Absolutely. And also with the target group, it's like we are writing for people that we want us to listen. So like also identifying, like if you are part of the net of EcoSchools network as well, you also want to write to other students or your parents or the local community that you want to be listened by them and involve them in actions.
Yeah.
I can see that we have one participant unmuted. Pamela, do you have any questions?
Hi. Yes, good morning. Yes, I managed to get on, Gracia. Thank you very much. Good morning, Pedro. Thank you. I found this talk very illuminating. I have a question for you, a specific question, and I think I know the answer, but I'd like some guidance. My students across 7 schools in the US Virgin Islands are participating in a disaster risk reduction management grant, which sounds quite dry, and it can be dry. And what they have to come up with by the end of the program is they have to come up with a resiliency design project. I have really worked hard at trying to imbue the human element in this, but for certain reasons, mainly time, we have had to do quite a route march in terms of fulfilling the requirements of the program. One of the things that we have tried to encourage the schools and students to do is the equivalent of Humans in New York. Go into the community and ask community members of different generations what their experience of climate changes and flooding. What they're going to be doing is at the end of the program, there will be a student end of program forum where they present their resiliency design projects for each individual campus. How can I create an area or and this is the question, how can they bring the human narrative into the obligation of what can we do to extend it to bring it alive rather than just presenting a resiliency design project?
Well, I would say that obviously when you say a resiliency design project, we're talking about something that is policy oriented, and I have certainly worked in policy capacities for many years, writing very dry UN reports and things like this. But the advantage that I had was that whenever I became a consultant in that field, I was already a journalist prior to that. And prior to being a journalist, I had been a reader of The Economist for the last 25 years, I think since I was 15. And so one thing that I always inserted into my stories was the little interviews, the little people that you meet along the way and that you have a brief chat with, and they tell you one sentence, 2 sentences. So I always insisted in making sure that my policy reports included personal narratives. It is increasingly accepted in that context, actually, to find little boxes, little insets in your reports in which you kind of reflect on what you are recommending in terms of policy or in terms of a more technical grid, but you actually put it in the first person. Natalia said so and so, and this is her story. And you don't have to give it a lot of space. You can give it 5 lines, 6 lines, but that's immediately very, very relatable. Now, I find your idea about the US Virgin Islands, and I'm sorry I called you the Bahamas. The map was pretty small.
Yes, I couldn't find myself on it.
So your idea of doing Humans of New York in that context is brilliant, because it's something very simple. You just ask the person, can I take your picture? Very much like the pictures I just showed you about the island. All I did was I spoke to people for 2 minutes, and then I asked, can I take your picture? And everyone is so aware that the story I am covering there is such an important story for them that they want to contribute. And so you ask, can I take your picture? It can be a very standard picture. It's just a person standing in front of whatever is relevant in that case. You get the name, you maybe get the age if they want to give you, and you write 2 sentences below. This is this person in this place doing this. This is what they said, and you include 1 sentence. That's all you need to inject that personal connection into it.
Right. Thank you. That's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have other questions yet? Lucia?
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
How are you?
Yes.
Hi. Nice to hear you. Very useful for everyone. I have one additional, maybe a little bit specific question about the global context of stories, because particularly for young reporters, I think, you know, aged from 11 to 14, they are maybe more focused or feeling familiar to local communities. So do you think that this global perspective is a necessary part of each contribution, or is it maybe just good to give some hints, links to maybe bring the global context into the contribution? This is maybe some of your thoughts. I know it's very difficult to give a clear answer, just maybe some recommendations that would be useful for teaching our teachers and also young reporters in the future. Thank you in advance.
It's actually not a very difficult question at all. It's a very simple question. I don't think you should be including global elements into the story. I think what I was referring to is you need to find global linkages, right? So if you are talking about, for instance, microplastics, we know that this is a global problem, and you should probably, or the student should probably include a sentence in which it wraps up the reasoning by saying, globally, microplastics are responsible for X amount of whatever on the oceans. But really, the key thing is for the stories to be told locally. What I was proposing is that, in fact, the more local you go, the more interested someone will be. So I don't think that people will be uninterested just because a story is about, say, Slovenia. People in other places will be curious about that story as long as that story is told through a specific that I can relate to, that I haven't heard before, regardless of where it is. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of the same context. We're all, within YRE, we're all looking for context in what's happening in the environment, right? So we're all looking for case studies and best practices and all that. So regardless of where that story is, we will be interested, and the audience that is interested in this kind of stories will be interested as well. So it's really more about finding the local stories. I'll give you an example of a filmmaker, very famous Inuit filmmaker. So he lives in Arctic Canada, and he is a member of the Academy in Hollywood. He's what you call a cult director. This guy has never told a story that was not about his small community of 3,000 people in northern Canada, in the Arctic. All his stories are about his community, and that's what makes him a global star, because at the end of the day, we are connecting with stories that are so human, so on the base level, right? He's not trying to tell you a story about globalization. You can see the globalization through his story because it's affecting people on the ground. It's affecting everything they do. So I believe really that we need to be focusing on local stories. It doesn't mean being blind to the global narrative. It means inserting the global narrative only as it pertains to making it relevant, but in the process of telling the local story, and not the opposite. So not telling a global narrative and then making it local. I think it's important for us to talk about the things that are close to us, the things that we have access to directly, and make it relevant to others by connecting to what other people's experiences are, rather than trying to focus our attention on someone else's experience.
Well, thank you so much. I was looking for something. So great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that we also need to wrap up. The time is short. And I have a request to everyone. If you have other questions, we will be sending you SurveyMonkey questionnaire. You can also put your questions into that, and Pedro will answer it later. And also please tell others that this webinar will be repeated on 25th of February at 9 in the morning, Central European time. So if you have someone who you feel that will be interested about it, please let them know. And for today, thank you very much. See you next time, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro.